because coding happens to be one of the most economically valuable use cases of AI, we see the gap closing faster and faster between open and closed source.
We're so excited to be joined by Anastasios, founder of Ella Marina. So we just kicked off a new year, 2026. 2025 was the year of agents, vibe coding. What is the year of 2026 going to be?
Well, there's so much investment in AI these days. We should expect to see increased diversity and fragmentation. By that I mean, gone are the days where one number can describe how good a model is. There's going to be so many models. Every frontier lab is going to have several releases in 2026, major ones. And that's going to be across small models and big models. It's going to be domain-specific models like coding models and more. And then there's, in addition to those, 4 or 5 names that everyone knows, there's going to be dozens of different smaller labs, especially in multimodal, that are developing amazing models with different tastes and different strengths and weaknesses. But it also means that users are going to be increasingly dealing with a fragmented market, which means that they're going to need places to look to say, hey, what even are the new releases? How can I deploy them in a unified way to my infrastructure? Cerebras has a big place in that in open source. We expect to see American open source models this year as well coming out, which is very exciting.
Over the past year, it has become very clear that traditional benchmarks are not necessarily the best indicator for how models are actually performing. Can you explain what Ella Marina does directly and why human preference data gives a much clearer picture for model performance?
So Ella Marina works differently from a standard benchmark and is more geared around measuring the real-world utility of AI. And let me just explain that by first drawing a distinction between the standard static benchmark and how Ella Marina works. Static benchmarks, what they are is essentially a test. It's a set of questions in a domain-specific vertical that somebody goes out and collects. Let's take 100 multiple choice questions about ancient history, and we're going to give them to a model and see how well it performs. The issue is that when you keep testing models over and over and over again on the same test, they end up memorizing the test, but they might not actually know anything about ancient history. Ella Marina works differently in the sense that we don't have a fixed set of questions. Actually, all the questions that we get every day are new. We've got tens of millions of users every month that are coming to Ella Marina and asking questions about whatever they want. And so they end up being very diverse. It can be anything from math to coding questions, to questions about business, to questions about law, to medicine, to romance. Anything that people are asking about in the real world, they're also asking about on Ella Marina. It's a very global community, hundreds of languages. By virtue of this diversity, the benchmark that you get reflects a lot of unexpected behaviors that you get when you deploy a model in the wild. And by virtue of that fact, each model only sees any question once. And so it can't overfit them. So that's structurally what makes our benchmark different. And of course, there's always a place for static benchmarks to analyze very specific, domain-specific behavior. But Ella Marina, you can think about as the sort of source of ground truth for how they operate in the wild.
A lot of these benchmarks, they only have a couple of hundred questions, but it's always PhDs or they're bringing in extreme experts to actually write or evaluate these questions. What does that look like on Ella Marina?
Well, our philosophy on Ella Marina is to source organic usage data from what we call unhirable experts. People that never would be the ones to write these questions on benchmarks because they're actually busy doing their job. They have a calling. We can actually find them organically within our data because they love using Ella Marina. We actually released a blog post on this recently called Arena Expert. We have 5 to 8% of our users end up being these PhD quality, really high taste users. And we identify them by looking at their prompt history via like LLM judges. And so once we know who those users are, and we can segment them also by occupational category like legal, medicine, business, marketing, and so on. Then we can construct leaderboard that says, hey, if you really care about what those super high taste, very niche professionals are doing, Ella Marina is the place to go.
As models do become smarter, there's going to reach a point when humans are no longer able to, evaluate these models. And so what then?
The most valuable thing about Ella Marina is that we're exposing models to real users. And real users are doing things on our platform with AI. But that doesn't mean that they will be moving forward.
Okay.
Or maybe they will be for some aspects, but not others. For example, Why do we necessarily need humans to be grading responses for factuality? Humans get facts wrong all the time. I believe that moving forward, we're going to have AI judges that are better at judging factuality than humans. And so there's going to be some aspects that only humans will be able to do. Things like taste, things like how well is the model communicating? It's almost like an HCI question, how well the model communicates with me. And I imagine us evolving more in that direction where we have a hybrid approach.
Open source models, I mean, they're not the ones at the top of the benchmarks, but in practice, it sounds like people are still choosing them.
Well, to some extent, the best benchmark is usage. If you look at a category like coding, 20 to 25% of the market share that we see in terms of usage on Alamarina comes from open source models. And you can see that replicated across the industry because these multi-turn, multi-step agentic workflows that people are using open source models for, you know, that's what they're particularly good at, especially by virtue of the fact that you can use a custom inference provider like Cerebras to make very fast inference. You can also loop together multiple open source models depending on the efficiency, you know, smaller models when you want to be fast and cheap, larger models otherwise, in order to create an end-to-end workflow. That's what we see people doing.
Do you see people using open source models differently from closed source models in terms of prompting, use cases, expectations?
Absolutely. So let me first look at the data. If you look at Alamarina, the 4 categories where open source models preferentially are used more in comparison to closed source models are math, coding, instruction following, and multi-turn. Those are the sort of top 4 categories where open source models have more market share. And what is that telling us about the way people use these models? They're using them for more technical tasks. Instruction following and multi-turn are indicative of the agentic pipelines that people want to use these models in. Of course, they're configurable. You can prompt them in all sorts of different ways. It's less so much about using a consumer interface like a chatbot or whatever, but rather integrating them into your software development workflow and developing a multi-turn and multi-stage agent. And of course, they need to do so in combination with an inference provider, a provider like Cerebras. You want these models to be working quickly for you.
Are there any ways that you see open source models still, either clearly lag behind closed models where you've seen them catch up, or what trends have you seen there?
On Alamarina, 2 places where we see open models shining, not necessarily beating closed source models yet, but possibly soon, would be coding and Chinese. By virtue of this fact, those 2 areas, and because coding happens to be one of the most economically valuable use cases of AI, we see the gap closing faster and faster between open and closed source.
What do you think it's going to take for, open source to finally beat closed source?
I think it's a matter of time. We already have frontier quality open source models like GLM. If you just look at the curve and you extrapolate, it's going to get there. And there's a lot of incentives and money and so on in the development of open source models.
Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about open source versus closed source. And if you are interested in trying out the top model, you can get started for free at either Cerebras or Alamarina.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.